Hello everyone and welcome to today's training video. Today we're going to be talking about using the iStar sCMOS as a slave and how this fits into various experimental and timing diagram considerations, and hopefully give you an idea of how this maybe necessarily differs from when the camera is the master in a timing situation, and also some of the extra considerations and things you need to take into account when using the iStar sCMOS as a slave as opposed to the master. So in today's training video, in our setup today, what we have is the camera setup as a slave. And how we've got this arranged is we have our laptop plugged in through USB to our iStar sCMOS. This enables us to change the settings and various parameters of the camera and get it ready to accept a trigger from an external source. We then also have our gate monitor, and this is plugged in from the socket at the front of the iStar sCMOS into our oscilloscope. We then also have a fire out pulse from our iStar sCMOS plugged into the oscilloscope. This will then let us know when and where the sensors are acquiring and when it's not acquiring, etc., and what it's doing, whether it's active or not. And then we also have an external trigger, and we're generating this external trigger pulse through a digital delay generator that we have set up. So we have this external trigger plugged also into our camera to trigger it. We also have it plugged into our oscilloscope, so we can see where various features such as the fire out and the gate monitor lie in relation to this external trigger pulse. A word about this external trigger, in that when you're wiring it up, if you wire it up like this, you need to make sure the impedance is correctly matched, because you're plugging it into two different things and it can maybe be a bit of an issue sometimes. So here's the iStar sCMOS that we have. This iStar sCMOS has a C-mounting flange at the front here, and we're going to put a C-mount lens on the front of it just for purposes of this video. In terms of the ports we're using on the camera today, we're using the USB port to connect the camera to the laptop, obviously the power supply, and we're also using the fire pulse. So this is the pulse which will output to our oscilloscope to let us know whether the sensor is active or not. And we're also using like external trigger input port from, hypothetically this could be your laser or whatever digital delay generator you're using, but today obviously it's from our digital delay generator. We also have our digital delay generator over here and our oscilloscope, which you may recognize from our last great video. So as you can see here, we have done a very neat job of wiring together our iStar sCMOS, our oscilloscope, and our DDG. We have BNC to SMA cables going from our DDG into the back of our iStar sCMOS, and we have BNC to SMA cables going from the fire output of the iStar sCMOS into the oscilloscope. I should add the one from DDG is the external trigger cable. And then we have a BNC to BNC cable going from our external trigger, which is our DDG, into our oscilloscope as well. So then on our oscilloscope, we will see our external trigger, our fire pulse, and our gate monitor pulses. We've also got our power cable and our USB cable obviously plugged back into the back of the iStar. So let's set up our camera in Solus to we'll start with just acquiring a single image, then we'll build up from there. So we want to be in single scan mode, which we're already in. And in terms of triggers, we want to now swap to external trigger because we're going to trigger using our digital delay generator that's running at 6 Hz. In terms of gating, I think we will run a gate of just 1 millisecond. That should be enough to start with. And yeah, we are ready to go and acquire a single image. And here we are. So I think we'll start by talking about, what the timing diagram looks like when you do take a single shot like this, when you have your camera set up as a slate. And we'll go for a really simple example. So say hypothetically you had some form of event that is occurring. It could be your laser shot or something that's your event, and you want to look at something that occurs sometime after that event, but relatively close to it. Well, from your event, you will have, or the trigger of your event, you'll have some kind of external trigger. So this could be an output from your laser. And you can use this external trigger to then trigger your sensor exposure, which is what we've got in our setup here today. But there'll be a delay between this initial rising edge of your external trigger and your exposure time of your sensor starting. And this is called insertion delay. And it's often triggered by things such as sensor keep clean cycles occurring, and things to that effect. You also have a time delay between this edge and your photocathode opening. However, this delay tends to be relatively small, more of the order of picoseconds, whereas this is more of the order of nanoseconds, this insertion delay. And so this is more or less the kind of timing diagram we'd expect for a single image acquisition. And we'll see now when we actually then capture the image in software, what we actually do see in reality when we come to these kind of circumstances. And we'll take a closer look at that insertion delay. So if we press acquire on our image and we take a look at the oscilloscope trace, let's have a look. What we can see is sort of as we expected. We have this blue line at the top, which is our external trigger from our digital delay generator, and you can see it here. It's hard to see any distance at this magnification, but we'll zoom in a second and look at the insertion delay. But you can see, our external trigger. Number 2 here is our fire signal, so our sensor activation time. And then down here, number 3, we have our gate activation, and you can see the opening edge and the closing edge of that. So now let's take a look and zoom in on the oscilloscope at this region between number 1 and number 2, between our input signal and our fire signal, and we might be able to see the insertion delay. So if we zoom in scale on our oscilloscope, what we can hopefully see when we get sort of down to the sort of nanosecond time scale is a gap in time, a quite significant gap in time between our external trigger pulse in yellow and our internal fire pulse in aqua. And then if we just look at this in detail on our sort of web upload of the what the oscilloscope reading looks like, you can clearly see this gap in time of maybe 100 nanoseconds between the activation of the external trigger pulse and the activation of the sensor. There is a gap between the photocathode and the external trigger pulse, but that's only because it's set up such that you only activate the gate once the camera is actually activated. In theory, you could actually reduce this time a little bit more. So this is just a good example of what your insertion delay can look like. And typically, you'll find a little bit more jitter between this and the between your external trigger input and your fire pulse, compared like on the order of nanoseconds, whereas you'll be looking at sort of picoseconds between your gating and your external trigger if you were to really analyze the jitter on it. So now we've taken a single image, I think it's logical to move on to the next potential thing you might want to do, which is take a kinetic series with the camera as a slate. And it's relatively simple and the same as acquiring a single image. So if this is your timing setup where you have your event, your external trigger that sort of triggers the event but simultaneously triggers your sensor, and then you have your photocathode gate. If you're taking a kinetic series, when the camera is ready to accept another external trigger signal, after it's read the sensor out, etc., your second event will occur, and if its camera is ready, the external trigger that occurs then will then, with the insertion delay, then trigger another sensor exposure and another photocathode gate at the same time. setting kinetic series, if we take it from the point we left it in single scan mode, it's relatively simple. We just go to acquisition mode and select kinetic series. And then from here, we can choose whatever kinetic series length we want, so say 10 frames. And we can then adjust the gate delay, gate width if we wanted to, and various parameters, what the readout rate is, etc., or binning, same sort of process as you would have if you're taking a single frame. And so, yeah, I think let's just press, let's acquire with this and see what our oscilloscope looks like. So we'll acquire in live mode. And yeah, if we take a look at our oscilloscope, and if we look here at our oscilloscope signal, we can see that we have our external trigger signal and our fire signal from our sensor activation and our gate activation as well. But we can see that obviously we have a second one that's followed on here. And if we could zoom out enough, we could image them all. We would still have the same insertion delay though that we had in the single image. And if you zoomed in on the nanosecond scale, we would still see the same insertion delay that we saw before. So if we go back to take our kinetic series on our oscilloscope and we refocus it into the middle, so we get something that looks a bit like this. I think it's worth pointing out that obviously we can change all these parameters as per you can when the camera's the master. So say we want to increase our exposure time or increase our gate width. That's relatively straightforward. So we'll increase our gate width to say 5 milliseconds. We can maybe add a 5 millisecond delay. We can increase our exposure time and maybe say double it. All things that you can do when you're, if you had the camera as a master as well. And then, we can change our kinetic series length. We've got all these options available to us. So just for the sake of, demonstration, let's just see how that affects how our oscilloscope looks. And as we can see here, we can see obviously our, our exposure time has increased. Where our gate is opening has shifted slightly to the right, and the width of it has also increased. And we still have the same external trigger pulse as we had before. So next I just want to talk about gate step mode, which I think is a particularly useful mode, and this is available on all iStar products. And this is particularly useful when you're looking at some kind of recurring phenomena with a time resolved element. And when that phenomena that you're looking at is recurring. So for instance, if you have a laser pulse that is generating a plasma and that is the same every time you fire it, gate step mode is a really great tool for temporally and spatially resolving the phenomena you're looking at. So for instance, if we have a plasma bloom like this, you could maybe set up your instrument to capture, say, 100 images, and in each image, the gate timing or the opening of your photocathode would move slightly forward in time by a set increment, such that you could take a series of images, say 100 images, to build up some kind of time resolved phenomenon such as this, and capture that with the camera. So what does gate step mode actually look like sort of in practice when you have an external trigger? So I want to just go back to our timing diagram and talk this through. So we have our timing diagram, we have time, we have our photocathode gate signal, we have our sensor, we have an external trigger, and we have our event. And so imagine we're looking at this event which has a duration in time, such as this. So, be it, the evolution of a plasma, or it could be some kind of fluorescence that has a set lifetime, etc. And we have our external trigger with a set insertion delay, which triggers this event. And then this insertion delay, this external trigger, is actually then triggering our sensor. And then what we're actually doing is we are setting ourselves up in the software such that we have our photocathode gate of a set time increment, and we can set it in the software such that this edges forward in time with every repeating iteration of the experiment. So we're then sampling a different spatial and temporal element of the event in time, and this allows us to then build up a picture of whatever phenomena we're looking at and how it changes over time. And so this is sort of how gate step mode works. So to set up gate step mode for this particular demonstration, we'll need to set our exposure time to say 180 milliseconds. We'll make it quite large so we can see it on our oscilloscope, and we'll set our gate width to say 30 milliseconds so we can clearly see it. You should also be careful to make sure that when you're setting up gate step mode, you tick this step button to turn gate step on. And then down here, we're setting our gate step parameters, and we'll set a constant of say 50 millisecond delay. So hopefully we'll be able to see sort of 3 peaks relatively evenly spread across our 180 millisecond exposure time. And that will give us, maybe a good illustration for the demonstration purposes of the software. So if we go now to take the signal, and we take a look at our oscilloscope, and from what you can see here, you can see we successfully demonstrated gate step mode. We've got our external trigger in blue, triggering our sensor in the fire out pulse. That's the aqua one. And then down here you can see we have our 3 gate widths of 30 milliseconds progressively spread out in time, about 50 milliseconds to the right relative to our sensor exposure. So that's how you set up gate step mode in the software. So the next sort of mode of operation of the iStar sCMOS I want to talk about is integrate on chip. And integrate on chip is a really great way of increasing your signal to noise ratio if you have a recurring event or phenomenon that is the same, it has the same characteristics at relative time intervals to the initiation of the event. So if, for instance, imagine we have some kind of external trigger, we can use this to trigger our sensor in an initial case. But what we can also do is we can set our sensor time period to be particularly long, or exposure time to be particularly long, such that we have several external trigger events falling within the span of the sensor's exposure. This then means what we can do is we can then trigger our photocathode at the same delta 1 time interval relative to the external trigger pulse. And this means that what we can do is we can, if we have an event such as this where it's the same event every single time it repeats, it means we can then capture an image at the same time, temporally and spatially, of this event. And this then lets us build signal on our sensor during this event, or during, it also builds signal on our sensor through multiple iterations of this event. Hence we get more signal in this single sensor exposure, hence we get better signal to noise ratio because, well, you're reading out the sensor once. So if we go back to our software and I'm thinking we'll set our exposure time to say 0.5 seconds just for the sake of this because we want quite a long cam exposure and this is quite good in the time frames we're looking. What we'll also do is we've increased our DDG repetition rates to 10 Hz just so we have a bit more of a occurring more rapidly. And because we're integrating on chip, we want a few repetitions to fall within the sensor exposure time. And we need to tick here, integrating chip on chip, and I think it should be good to go there. So 13 milliseconds might be a bit too long in terms of gate exposure, but let's look at that. So if we run this, and I've also set the sensor to be our trigger on our oscilloscope. So we're now running live, and as we see on our oscilloscope, we're getting the integrate on chip. See on the oscilloscope, we're getting the integrate on chip. It's working, so our gate is opening during our sensor exposures, and we're having multiple gatings occurring per sensor exposure at the same distance in time from the fire pulse that we're receiving. This might be quite actually, so I'll just go turn it to 3 milliseconds. Okay, and so that's how we set up integrated on chip.
Thank you for watching the Andor iStar sCMOS demo videos.